obviously, the fact that there is a security threat posed by states using financial channels is not a new observation. Anyone who's read, as I'm sure many of you have, Casino Royale by Ian Fleming will be aware that James Bond spends a lot of time in that, trying to stop a communist spy from using a casino to launder money going to a French trade union. This is something that was happening back in the 1960s and is happening now. But it was obviously a realization supercharged by the events of September the 11th, 2001, and the subsequent quest to try and crack down on terrorist finance. And for a long time, the discussion around the security dimension of finance was very much seen only through the frame of groups like Al-Qaeda and so on. Certainly since 2014 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then obviously with heightened attention on the role of Iran in the Middle East in funding Hamas, the Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and so on, there has been much greater attention on states rather than only non-state actors and how they are using the loopholes and lacunae in the global financial system to get money where they want to get it and to evade the detection of countries like ours. I'm really pleased to have this chance to chat to these excellent 4 people who represent 4 different sectors who all have really important roles to play in highlighting and identifying the difficulties that we face in tackling states exploiting the financial system. Immediately to my left, Tom Tugendhat MP, MP for Tunbridge in the county of Kent, Minister of State for Security until July last year, and before that an army officer, rising to Lieutenant Colonel, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes. In the middle, Elad, Vida. I'm going to pronounce someone's name wrong, and anyway, Elad Vida, who's come to talk to us from Israel, from the Israeli delegation to the FATF, and head of the international department at Israel's FIU, the Money Laundering and Terror Financing Prohibition Authority, obviously someone with huge experience in this particular area. To Elad's left, and replacing Catherine Belton, who's not able to be with us, is Andrew Fierman, head of National Security Intelligence at Chainanalysis. Those of you who don't know Chainanalysis, of which I suspect there are only very few, it is probably the world's leading private sector organization analyzing what is happening on the blockchain. Astonishing range of insights you can find on their website and from talking to Andrew. And then on the far left, Eliza Lockhart, who told me that she was Eliza as in Eliza Doolittle, and I've been terrified that I'm going to introduce her as Eliza Doolittle ever since. Research fellow here at RUSI, a lawyer from Australia who previously worked with the chair of the Australian Electoral Commission, so really interesting insights, obviously, into the integrity of our democratic processes like we were hearing about with the last session. Tom, if we could start with you. As a former Minister of Security, and obviously someone who continues to take a very close interest in this now, how serious do you consider the security threat posed by our adversaries' use and misuse of the global financial system? And how are they abusing it, and what does this mean for the rest of us?
Well, you started off by quoting James Bond, so I will start off by talking about another author of the darker side of human nature, a guy called Oliver Bullough, who's written a book called Moneyland, about the way in which money moves across the system. And one of the things that you chart out in this is the way in which individuals use money not just as a way of hiding corrupt gains, but actually a way of securing political and foreign influence. Now, quite a lot of the sort of things that you talk about that I think are worth highlighting are, of course, to do with Russia and Ukraine, and that's perfectly obvious. But the real challenge for us is not that Russia is corrupt or Ukraine has had corruption issues or whatever it happens to be, but how is that power leveraged against us? And that's where I think we need to be thinking much more clearly and much more strategically about that. Because what we're seeing is we're not just seeing the corruption of our agencies or attempts to get individuals to do things. We're actually seeing, in some cases, systemic threats to our financial stability by the way in which international threats or international rivals, maybe is a better word, are trying to leverage that capital. And we see it certainly, I'm sure we'll come to it in terms of blockchain and things like that. We certainly see it in different forms of cryptocurrency, but we also see it in real currencies, if you like, in fiat currencies, in the way that they're leveraged. So I think there's an awful lot there.
And when you were in government, I mean, obviously, as security minister, there are a wide range of security threats. Is this something that you would consider in conjunction with other security threats? Is it something that you look at separately? I'm just wondering how the process of government, the process of analysis works.
So it's alongside others, but clearly it's a distinct stream in some ways. But it is very unusual to find a financial strategic threat that doesn't have physical, real-world corollaries. Whether that's a terrorist group or whether that's an intelligence agency trying to achieve certain aims, the overlap is often very quick. And so making sure that you're leveraging that oversight and understanding what the connections are is incredibly important, because classically different elements point at different things, and so if you detect one element, it very often gives you a starting point into others.
Elad, obviously the front line of the financial system is everywhere, but a few places can that seem more real, obviously, than in Israel. The threat that you've seen, particularly from Iran, is obviously a real and enduring one. Could you describe roughly how that manifests itself on a day-to-day basis? What kind of tools are being used by Iranian actors to try and get money past your defenses?
Yes, I think, surprisingly or not, I might tap exactly to the ideas described by MP Tugendhat. First of all, if I have to think about this, I think there are three different perspectives we can relate to. First one is that, like it was described in relation to corruption, in the end, Iran uses financing as a modus operandi to, how to say it, he who owns the gold makes the rules. So somehow they've managed to get a correlated arena between Shiite and Sunnite organizations in Lebanon, in Gaza, and in Iran, something that from political perspectives or religious perspectives, you would think is very challenging, but having the buck, they've managed to do this. And not only to have this conjoined arena, but also deliver this alignment in plans, in timelines, etc., which makes things much more challenging. The second phase of it is of course, Iran as a country has at least 1-2 steps up capabilities when it comes to financing than terrorist organizations themselves. We know that when we speak about money laundering, usually we are looking on a risk-based approach for the bigger amounts. For terrorism purposes, much smaller amounts can suffice. But that's not what Iran is doing. Iran has been financing Hezbollah with something around, the estimates are around $1 billion every year in cash. They've been financing in recent years Hamas in growing amounts, significantly growing in their undertakings for this time at the war and after the war for the reconstruction in Gaza, again, to be those that hold the bucks and hold the decisions. And of course, when we are speaking about terrorism financing, it's not only financing in cash, it's also financing in kind. So the ability to deliver ammunition, rockets, etc., and use the state capabilities of smuggling through different areas in Africa, for example, or obtain certain substances in China or in other parts of the world and deliver them to Hezbollah. They are using this level of state threat for terrorism financing in volumes and scope that we have not seen before. And the third phase of it is the fact that they have taught, it seems, all of its proxies in Lebanon, the Houthis, and now in Gaza, to establish something which looks like a state within a state, right? And then the terrorist organization itself starts to adopt state-level capabilities of financing, of corrupting the entire system, one could call it collecting taxes, the other one can call it extortion of the population, but the ability to raise significant amounts and control the system through the financing is much more significant. In Gaza, it's very obvious, but when you think about it in Lebanon, Hezbollah is maintaining Lebanon in this state of corruption and non-functioning state, right?
Thank you. And just to remind everyone, I have an iPad here. This isn't because I'm watching the football results. It's because you are able to send in questions. You can scan the QR code on your lanyards, and please do send in questions as they occur to you, and I will get to them. So ask away. Andrew, we were talking earlier about Iran and its use of crypto technology to get around the restrictions placed on its financial system, which I was really interested by. I wasn't aware that they got that kind of so much expertise in that area. I suppose it's not surprising. Could you describe a little bit about that? And maybe afterwards we can come to how that is similar to what we've seen with other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing that's really important to realize is cryptocurrency is just another mechanism in the toolkit by illicit actors to launder their proceeds or move money. So when it comes to crypto, particularly regarding Iran, they actually have a pretty mature cryptocurrency ecosystem. There are nearly 50 cryptocurrency exchanges operating in the country. They've summed a total of over $10 billion. So it's being utilized by your everyday citizens, but obviously, Iran is a nation state, and we even just saw at the end of December, they decided to halt all withdrawals from all Iranian exchanges, so nobody could get their money out. I do think it is generally a lot of store of value for your everyday Iranian citizens, but when you're talking about state actors, particularly those like IRGC or funded by Hezbollah, they aren't going to be utilizing those mainstream cryptocurrency exchanges in Iran to facilitate their activity. Similarly, as you'd see in traditional finance, where they're going to use shell companies in third countries, they're not going to just send payments with IRGC, Tehran, Iran on their SWIFT messages, right? So in reality, we see the same typologies happening on the blockchain. They're using a lot of intermediaries, getting liquidity from varying sources. And we've seen quite a few different actions that have sanctioned entities that have been affiliated with these types of groups, and also seizures, which I'll get to in a minute, which is a great opportunity when it comes to crypto. But just in December of this year, an individual who had been sanctioned by the US a few years ago actually had an update to his designation, including 5 cryptocurrency addresses in the designation. Those accounted for over $300 million in processed money. Again, none of those were touching Iranian exchanges explicitly. And so we're talking about a different level of complexity here in the same similar method that they would use in traditional finance. But that said, the blockchain is transparent and immutable. That means that any blockchain information that you identify is permanently there. So there is forever an opportunity to investigate, identify who's behind certain transactions, disrupt, seize, and we've actually seen that actually through the National Bureau of Counterterrorism Financing in Israel with a Hezbollah-related seizure of $1.7 million due to a financier who was actually also later sanctioned by OFAC as well for being a financier of Hezbollah. So I think, while cryptocurrency, a lot of people think of it as, it's just being used by cyber criminals. I think, all crime is crypto crime when it comes down to it, and all types of criminals are using cryptocurrency in a host of different ways in order to facilitate what they're doing. And so I think, Iran is just one of those. Russia and quite a few other nation states are doing it in their own ways, but I'll probably leave that to later in the conversation.
Some of the people here may have been present for the breakfast briefing this morning about Operation Destabilize, when the National Crime Agency was talking about a recent operation they conducted with a cash for crypto money laundering operation here in the UK, run from Moscow. I'm interested to know if that kind of operation is similar to what you're describing with Iran, or whether they're, wildly different. I mean, it's, from an outsider, you think, well, it's all crypto, but presumably it's not as simple as that.
I think Russia's a little more brazen in their approach. We have seen a lot of Russian money laundering operations. Another one recently was a crypto exchange by the name of Cryptex, which was laundering over $1 billion in money for Russia. We also saw Operation Destabilize. We also saw the BKA in Germany shut down, I think it was 47 instant exchanges. And these are actually a really fascinating aspect of sanctions evasion in the cryptocurrency space, which is essentially we have all of our sanctioned Russian banks. They're subject to secondary sanctions. What individuals are doing, and whether it's for money laundering purposes, capital flight, TBD, but essentially for about $5,000, you can create a pre-generated website that is hosted on some other entity that's facilitating this as infrastructure. And you can connect your sanctioned Russian bank to that exchange, upload your rubles to the exchange, and have them process it out to a cryptocurrency wallet of your choosing. Now, the challenge with this is that on the blockchain, all you're going to see is a transaction from Russian language instant cryptocurrency exchange to an individual. And those exchanges can also be used to facilitate crypto to crypto as well. But it really presents an opportunity to mask the sourcing of these Russian banks, which are subject to secondary sanctions. And maybe a little bit of a teaser for our crypto crime report coming up in just a few short weeks here, but we've seen these types of services processing anywhere, in aggregate, a total of $50–70 million a month. So, while we're not talking about the scale of the entire Russian economy, it's certainly no small amount of money.
Eliza, it's hard, obviously, to talk about Russia without talking about their role in destabilizing various democratic processes in European countries and, of course, in North America over the last decade or so. The sort of destabilizing of our democracy is something that's been discussed a lot recently. We heard about it in the last session as well. From your perspective as someone who looks at elections and the integrity of electoral processes, how seriously should we take the threat of foreign rivals, adversaries, attempting to undermine essentially the integrity of our political process in order to undermine our ability to respond to what they're doing?
Yeah. In my personal opinion, electoral interference and undue political influence is the most prevalent and pernicious state-based threat we currently face, and yet it is also the state threat that is the most underreported and frankly underestimated. If you can delegitimize or destabilize democratic decision-making, either in reality or just in appearance, you effectively poison the well from which all our rule of law, governance systems and structures flow. In terms of bang for your buck, I can't think of another vector that gets you that fundamental level of impact.
Okay.
Just to be cheery.
Could you discuss the kind of techniques that we see, the kind of techniques that you have been looking at, the kind of things we should be worried about, perhaps developing techniques?
I think, and you speak to anyone in the kind of electoral integrity space for even a short period of time, and they'll say the same thing. We know what's happening. We've mentioned Casino Royale. It kind of reminds me of the scene in Casablanca where the French police officer comes in and says, I'm shocked that there's gambling happening in this institution, and then takes his winnings. We know what's going on. We know how they're doing it to a great extent. CFS and a lot of other think tanks and academics contributed to a publication that Spotlight on Corruption released last year called Protecting UK Democracy, in which they summarised the last 15 years of independent inquiries and expert opinions on the type of reforms that we need to conduct. And the list Joe Powell gave us a snapshot is exactly the same. The use of unincorporated associations, the lack of caps on donations, the lack of caps on corporate donations. So there are clear, gaping back doors through which money is coming. We also have an under-resourced and an under-empowered electoral commission who frankly have their hands tied behind their backs trying to deal with this. So there are a lot of things we could do, and we're simply not doing them. And that is incredibly frustrating.
Tom, you're an MP. You were in government until pretty recently. Obviously, we all have our priorities, and they're not necessarily the priorities that are going to be shaken out at the bottom of a cabinet discussion or whatever. It is, though, however, it does seem an urgent priority for maintaining the integrity of our political system is to try and make sure that we can at least know where the money coming in is coming from. Why do you think that this is something which is struggling to gain the kind of political traction that I would quite like it to have?
You don't need to read very much further than the Sunday Times to see several stories about why this is something that affects all political parties. And when I was Security Minister, one of the things I did was set up the Defending Democracy Task Force to bring things together, to offer support to the Electoral Commission, and to see how we could assist better. Without going too far down the line, it was one of the things that I tried to do was to make sure that those who were receiving donations from individuals had a way of checking the individual. What surprised me was not the resistance I got from the political parties, but the resistance I got from the agencies.
Okay.
Who viewed it, I think wrongly, as politics, not security, who viewed it as dragging them in to different ways, and they were very unwilling, very, very unwilling to be part of it. But of course, political parties have no ability other than a Google search, for which, in most circumstances, you get either a non-answer or a meaningless answer.
The issue I want to get onto now is sanctions. But before we get to sanctions...
I'm sanctioned 3 times, is that it?
Only 3?
Only 3. I'm very popular in North Korea.
Are you sanctioned by North Korea?
No.
You're not sanctioned by North Korea?
Iran, Russia and China, not North Korea.
So you can still do business in North Korea?
They speak very highly of me in Pyongyang.
That's good to know. Yeah. Before we get onto sanctions, though, what kind of tools are effective when it comes to tackling state-based financial threats in your experience? What have you seen that has actually worked? Because we will come to sanctions as a separate topic, but I'm just wondering before we get to that.
So the first thing that is effective is going after the enablers. We talk about foreign threats. Let's not kid ourselves that none of these would operate unless British lawyers, British banks, British accountants, British were willing to do business with them. Some of you may remember that many years ago, when I was chairing the Foreign Affairs Committee, I produced a report called Moscow's Gold. And I won't accidentally quote from it, because I only quote from it literally and exactly, because the report itself is covered by parliamentary privilege. And if I were to misquote it, even by a letter or a line, I would get sued by one of the organisations that is named in it. But doing that report, pointing out and using parliamentary privilege to do it, was incredibly important in stopping that organisation, or rather, putting a price on that organisation for the actions that it had been taking. It's a law firm here in the UK, and it dissuaded many others from doing so. In fact, a friend of mine estimated that it cost that law firm an awful lot of money. I won't go into the details on it, but it's a huge amount. And that's, the reality is we're not going to stop the KGB or the oligarch or the whatever it is from trying to do it. That's outside our reach. But we do have influence over people in the UK, and it's, I can't be alone in finding it pretty unacceptable that people who are very happy to take, knighthoods and debenture tickets to Chelsea or Wimbledon are actually making their money by profiting off corruption overseas that undermines the security here at home.
Elad, from your perspective, the role of enablers in helping states to get their money into the international financial system. London is regularly criticised, not least by me, for having done this. I'm interested in an Israeli perspective on the role of international financial centres, London in particular, but others if that interests you, when it comes to essentially allowing Iran to circumvent the restrictions that are placed, or other threats that you see to circumvent the restrictions that are placed against them.
So I think that here there are very different modi operandi between Hamas and Hezbollah. For Hezbollah, who from pretty much the day one or the first days were close to 100% dependent on the Iranian money that comes in cash, in briefcases. Their enablers are mostly the smugglers through Syria. This is another change in the area now, but it's less interesting, I guess. It's something to address, but less interesting. Hamas are much more versatile. And they are using many different channels to gather funds, to transfer funds. One of the most prominent ones before the war, before the terrorist attacks of October 7th and afterwards, is through the abuse of NPOs. And in that sense, we can see hundreds of millions of dollars, euros, pounds, whatever you would like, flowing in for years and each year. And in that sense, indeed, there are. It's not enablers in the same sense that we think about when we speak about money laundering, right? It's not the lawyers, but they are using corporations, like when they are using their investment portfolio, a listed company in Turkey. They are using, as I said, NPOs. Unfortunately, in accordance with our financial intelligence gathered, somehow the UK ended up as being a major hub for this. There are quite some sizable NPOs that are listed.
Just to say, NPOs, for those who don't know, the abbreviation is non-profit organisations. Sometimes we say NGOs, just in case anyone's confused by that. Sorry, Karen.
So NPOs or NGOs that are designated by the US and Israel for more than a decade can keep on working here in the UK. And in that sense, you mentioned sanctions. Looking at it from law enforcement or security perspective, sanctions are first and foremost a policy or political measure, and then you also want to seize the funds. When it comes to seizing the funds, actually the work stream that goes is that by the time you make the designation public, you have already probably put your hands on the funds that you're aware about. And then the announcement itself is more, as I said, a political measure. Of course, in that same moment, the organization is trying to find other ways to funnel the funds. But then also, not making the designation is another policy or political statement. And that's, I fear, how the UK, of all places and all financial centers, finds itself as a place where funds are coming from America, from different countries in Europe, and serves as a vehicle to forwarding then the funds to Turkey, Lebanon, and then to Gaza.
I'm keen to talk about sanctions, partly because alongside Operation Destabilize, OFAC sanctioned the organizations that were investigated and had previously sanctioned the various exchanges 2 years previously, and yet they're still in business. Clearly, sanctions, when it comes to tackling a threat on a state level or a state-protected threat, are not necessarily as effective as we might like. It's a sort of subsidiary question here from, these questions keep disappearing. Matthew Redhead did ask, I can't see it now, about if a criminal group is essentially supported by a state, should we see it as a state threat as well? So it's kind of part of the same question.
So when it comes to cryptocurrency, I think there is a lot of opportunity to impact and disrupt networks, obviously depending on the network, right? If you're talking about a donation campaign from a terrorist organization, it has to be public, it has to be out there, and when you're using blockchain analytics tooling, once that address is identified and labeled as a terror financing affiliated wallet, any mainstream exchange that's utilizing blockchain analytics is going to effectively stop that activity. We've seen a few examples of that being really successful. So Al-Qassam Brigades was one of the first terrorist organizations to solicit cryptocurrency donations online. They tried to obfuscate their techniques a little bit. Won't get into details for this combo, but find me after, happy to dive into it. But eventually they announced that they were going to stop doing cryptocurrency related donations because their donors kept getting prosecuted. So that was in 2023. Additionally, after October 7th occurred, a very pro-Hamas Telegram channel by the name of Gaza Now and an individual named Mustafa Yash was sanctioned by OFAC and OFSI as well. And cryptocurrency addresses were included in that designation. If you total up the sum of funds that that donation campaign had received leading up to their designation, it was somewhere around $4 million. Now, they can continue generating new cryptocurrency addresses all they want, but as long as they're soliciting donations on a public page like a social media page, those donation addresses are identified quickly by law enforcement, by blockchain analytics tooling, and effectively helps limit at least the exposure. So we've seen just thousands of dollars being donated to them now, and not to say that any dollar is too much going to a terrorist organization, but certainly it's a significant drop-off. Now, to your point, Oliver, I think when you're talking more about nation-state activity, it definitely becomes more complex. We saw an entity by the name Garantex, which is a sanctioned Russian cryptocurrency exchange. Now, when they were designated in April of 2022, so shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, 3 cryptocurrency addresses were included with that entity. However, utilizing blockchain analytics tooling, so teams like mine are constantly following and mapping out the ecosystem that is these entities. And now we have over 1 million addresses that are affiliated with this one specific entity. So 1 million addresses is a lot to follow. But when you're using blockchain analytics tooling, there's a lot that can be done to surface this information more quickly than you might in traditional finance, where they're building networks of shell companies across dozens, if not hundreds of different banks to spread out their networks. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for disruption, especially when you're talking with stablecoins. Stablecoin issuers have the opportunity to disrupt and seize funds that are sitting in a wallet, not relevant necessarily to the jurisdiction in which those funds are being held. So I think that's quite an amazing opportunity when it really comes down to it, if you're trying to look for opportunities to disrupt networks like that.
To what extent is that opportunity theoretical at the moment? Are stablecoin issuers actually helping to that extent?
Yeah, absolutely. It's happening all the time. I think one of the examples, I mentioned the entity by the name of Cryptex before, which was a Russian money laundering operation. And upon the time of their takedown, FIOD in the Netherlands, alongside the support of Chainanalysis and Tether, where it's able to seize $7 million from one of the USDT wallets that the individual that ran the service was operating. So it's certainly a viable option in today's day and age.
Eliza, I'm going to come to you now. Anupreet Amal from Eversheds has sent a question in which is pointing at the elephant in the room that we've all been tiptoeing around all day. Just going to read out the question. Given Trump's pausing yesterday of the DOJ's FCPA enforcement, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for those of you who don't know, which I'm sure is none of you, will other countries also lose interest in corruption enforcement against companies? Just to broaden that out, the US has been obviously the keystone of the global Western efforts to prevent the misuse of the financial system by geopolitical adversaries. Considering the speed of how things are moving in Washington at the moment. It's obviously very difficult to make any predictions about what might happen. But with the disbanding of task force klepto capture, with the pausing of FCPA enforcement and so on, there is obviously a risk that essentially this alliance could fracture and no longer exist in the way that it has existed up to now. How does the effort to prevent electoral funding misuse look in a world where that isn't just coming from Russia, Iran, China, or wherever, but it's also coming from Elon Musk and other people of that nature? I mean, how complicated does that become?
Incredibly complicated, and it's already started. You can see that Musk has turned his attention to Europe, particularly the Digital Systems Act, which has probably the only power to control or at least sanction his empire. And he is seemingly very interested in destabilizing both the EU and various member state governments with the aim of creating broader European disunity. And to have Europe and UK as its allies faced now with not only the traditional big four state-based actors, Gulf actors, but now to have essentially an American oligarch wielding an incredibly powerful platform with the backing of an American administration, it's the amount of pressure that is going to be on Europe and by extension the UK and by extension the Five Eyes Alliance as well is going to be immense. How we respond to that, whether we rise or we fracture, I hope it's the former.
Almost makes us nostalgic for when it was just an Australian oligarch to worry about, hey.
Yeah, I'll just go home and you guys can sort it out.
There's a question here from Anonymous. Thank you, Anonymous, for this one. Tom, building on that, what kind of challenges are there for multilateral cooperation against state-based threats, given the my question, can this stop this disappear? Oh yeah, given the threat of geopolitical fragmentation that Eliza's talking about. I mean, we're talking obviously about in Europe at the moment, obviously the rise of quite challenging political players in Germany, potentially in France, obviously in Slovakia and in Hungary already. It does mitigate against trying to build a really stable alliance.
I mean, yes and no, in the sense that, yes, of course, for jurisdictional reasons, that's true, in the sense of people ruling different jurisdictions. But there is a centralization of many of the platforms, right? I mean, you're sponsored by Stripe, which has now become basically the plumbing of an awful lot of financial transactions around the world. And if you have cooperation from firms like them, from some of the exchanges, from some of the... You can get into quite a lot of this through cooperation in ways that you couldn't 10, 15 years ago, because the level of cooperation is that much greater. So I think there's real opportunity here. In fact, I was working very closely with the US administrations, with different European, Australian, Canadian, and others. And there's a real opportunity to do it. So I wouldn't be too bleak about it. I mean, it's difficult, that's true, but the way in which they work is more responsive in some ways with the platforms available.
If you had any tips to the government at the moment in how to...
Call an election. Oh, sorry.
I think be careful what you wish for, Tom. If you had any tips for the government, apart from call an election and allow Nigel Farage to become PM,
I don't think that would happen.
But for how to bring international partners along with, for example, the proposal for a summit of international financial centres and so on, to try and to do the work that David Cameron managed to do in 2016 and build that kind of coalition around fighting corruption. What are the messages which you'd hit?
So I think the prime message is to look at the ways in which individuals are connected to it. So I would be talking about domestic corruption in various of our jurisdictions. I'd be talking about the ways in which terrorist financing is a direct threat to others, or state-based financing is a threat to others. I mean, Elad quite rightly spoke about Iran. Iran is also, by the way, very good at stealing money. They are some of the world's best bank robbers these days. Not as good as North Koreans, but I'm very popular in North Korea, so I don't like to besmirch them. But the best cyber criminals today are states, and they are operating. They're operating on the exchanges because, to quote the old maxim, that's where the money is. And so pointing out the risks, highlighting the risks, supporting individuals is, I think, where the government should be. And by the way, to be fair to Dan Jarvis, that is where he is. He's doing a very good job. I shouldn't say this on the record, should I? But he's doing a very good job. And he's highlighting quite rightly many of the areas where we're working on before and working on now.
That leads us quite nicely into a question from Aidan Larkin from Asset Reality for Elad about how sanctions that you guys have used have managed to progress to asset seizure and recovery. Obviously, there continues to be a lot of discussion around property like the $2.5 billion from the sale of Chelsea Football Club, which is sitting in an escrow account in this country, to yachts sitting in harbours in San Diego and so on, about what's happening with that. You've obviously in Israel had far longer experience of this. How is that working in terms of asset seizure and recovery? Do you have more success?
So first of all, we are very happy with the results, specifically when it comes to crypto and other seizures, but this is still a drop in the bucket. Having said that, first of all, as I mentioned, usually the seizures themselves take place before or right with the designation or a seizure order being published. But the usefulness of a seizure order is actually for the day after, for the gathering of further financial intelligence to see, to promote exactly what was mentioned in these private-public partnerships and global partnerships in trying to find, okay, where do the terrorist financiers take their funds next? How do they divert? Because they can open as many wallets as they want, they can use new methods, but we will see this forking of the financing. We will see, we are saying that these days, specifically in the social networking arena, the social networking analysis is very important. You try to find affiliation between persons, individuals, between organizations and wallets and Telegram channels and fundraising campaigns. And they can change the wallet, they can change the tunnel, but it will always be the same people. And so the publication of these designations or seizure orders, letting all of the private sector be aware of the names and of the methods and communicating with them to gather new intelligence, that's the real upside of this system.
So I'm interested in how you would assess the capabilities and determination of Western countries to tackle the new threats that you work on all the time. Are people alert to the complexities that you're talking about? Are they working seriously to try and prevent the misuse of new financial channels? And we've talked a lot about new financial channels, but new financial channels by adversaries and rivals?
So I've been at Chainanalysis for a little over 3 years now, and just watching the development of where sanctions have gone, especially when it comes to cryptocurrency, has really shown a lot of that comprehension within the Western ecosystem. I mean, the first OFAC designation involving cryptocurrency addresses were 2 individual Iranian nationals who were affiliated with the SamSam ransomware, for those of you who might be familiar. And just a handful of cryptocurrency addresses were included. That was a cyber-related sanctions designation. But as time has gone on, it's gotten to cryptocurrency exchanges and mixers. And now, I mean, we're looking at everything from fentanyl traffickers to cartel money launderers to drone manufacturers. I mean, like I mentioned before, cryptocurrency is being utilized by every type of illicit actor, and I think the sooner that everyone understands that, there's there's more opportunity for disruption of those networks. And I think, you were talking about the seizure side of it, and that is one aspect, but I do think there is another aspect of it, which is the exchanges that are facilitating transactions. They can be guardrails for protecting the ecosystem from this activity. And what I mean by that is, you have the blockchain analytics firms or the exchanges themselves identifying the misuse of cryptocurrency by those actors. They plug in the blockchain analytics tool. The tooling says these addresses belong to a sanctioned entity. And then those funds, which the sanctioned entity yesterday thought that they could process through your exchange, suddenly you're using blockchain analytics tooling and those funds are getting blocked, and you can catch millions more at any given point in time. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity for the whole ecosystem, both private and public sector, to help disrupt these types of risks.
So, Eliza, this may be our last question, depending on how long you're going to talk for, so no pressure. Obviously, there is money coming in all the time, whether it's from, we haven't really talked about China, I think partly because of the sheer complexity of talking about China. Maybe we'll try and come to China. But obviously a lot of damage has already been done to belief in the integrity of our financial system. To look at what happened in Romania, with the astonishing intervention to cancel the election, obviously Moldova, and so on. What sort of measures do we need to do to try and, I've actually stolen this question from Anonymous, but reverse the damage done by state-based actors in this, that's already been done?
Yeah, we need to get our own house in order, and quickly. Does anyone know what percentage of the UK population participated in the 2024 election? Yeah? 59%. There should be alarm bells descending. There should be sirens going. We are rapidly reaching a tipping point where our election will lose legitimacy simply because the majority of the population did not participate. And that is in no small part due to the damage that has been done. We need electoral reforms around party political financing. We need reforms around influence that is able to be exerted over our politicians standing for election and currently sitting. And we need it urgently.
As a politician currently sitting.
So, look, the figures are correct, it is 59%, but the reason I'm not quite sure I would read into that quite the negative outlook as you're looking is, I know this is going to surprise you, but by early May, I knew we were going to lose the general election. Everybody knew Labour was going to win the general election, and when you have very clear, likely results, turnout goes down. So, for example, Blair's second term, the turnout was roughly 60%. But when it was the Corbyn-May election, turnout went up to 80%. It's not surprising that at contentious elections people turn up, at obvious elections people don't bother. So I'm not quite sure I'd read the figures quite as starkly as you suggest. That doesn't mean we don't have to do reforms. It's another matter. But I'd be cautious about how you read those figures.
So Tom Tugendhat has committed his vote to electoral reform?
Certainly not.
Thank you, everyone. That's been really wonderful to hear you all. It's been great. Thank you for hanging around to listen to us. Really appreciate you being here. We now have one...
No. Round of applause.
A round of applause.